Jack Mercer, a retired Army veteran living deep in the frozen wilderness, had spent years digging a narrow tunnel beneath his cabin floor, a strange precaution. His neighbors laughed at whenever his name came up. They called it a bunker for a man afraid of shadows. On the night the winter storm closed in, his German Shepherd Ranger froze beside the hearth, ears locked forward, eyes fixed on the cabin door. A low growl rumbled from his chest, rising suddenly into sharp, urgent barks that shattered the quiet. Seconds later, a wounded policewoman stumbled out of the trees and toward Jack's door, breath breaking as she whispered that her own commander had ordered her silenced. Before Jack could answer, trucks surrounded the cabin. Doors were blocked. Fuel spilled across the snow. Fire followed. As flames climbed the walls and the blizzard erased the world outside, Jack understood the truth. The tunnel they mocked wasn't a shelter from winter. It was the only way out. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Wind worried the pines, and snow sifted down like ash over a cabin that preferred to be forgotten. Jack Mercer kept his world small on purpose. He was 42, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested heavy work rather than vanity, with a weathered face that looked carved by cold mornings and hard decisions. His hair was dark brown, threaded with early gray at the temples, usually hidden under a knit cap pulled low. A short, disciplined beard shadowed his jaw neat, never wild, because even in solitude he couldn't quite stop being the man who once folded shirts into perfect squares and checked doors twice. His eyes were a pale, steady blue, the kind that didn't rush to judgment but rarely changed its mind once it arrived. People in town said he had that 1,000-yard stare, but the truth was simpler. Jack had learned to look past noise, because noise got men killed. He'd brought that habit home from war like a souvenir he never asked for. He lived deep in the timber of northern Oregon, where the road narrowed into a rutted track and the track finally surrendered to trees. The cabin was old but stubborn, built of dark logs that carried the scent of resin and smoke. It sat in a clearing like an animal crouched for winter, low, quiet, ready. If you didn't know it was there, you could pass within 100 yards and never see it. That suited Jack. Silence didn't demand explanations. Silence didn't ask why a man woke at midnight with his heart sprinting and his hands already searching for a weapon that no longer belonged in his life. The only creature who could walk into that silence without being swallowed by it was Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd with a thick black saddle over warm tan fur, a heavy ruff around his neck that made him look bigger than he was, and a face that carried too much wisdom for a dog. He was 8 years old enough to be calm, young enough to still move like a shadow when duty called. His ears never flopped. They stood tall, always listening. His amber-brown eyes had a habit of holding Jack's gaze as if to say, "I'm here. Breathe." Ranger had a scar along his muzzle from some early life Jack never asked about, and one ear was notched at the tip, a small imperfection that made him look perpetually unimpressed with the world. He was not a loud dog. He did not waste sound. When Ranger barked, it meant something. Jack kept the cabin running with routines that were half survival and half penance. Split wood, haul water, patch leaks, check the generator, clean the stovepipe, sweep the porch. He treated winter like an enemy that didn't need to be hated, just respected. When the weather forecast talked about a storm line pushing in wind, heavy snow, plunging temperatures, Jack didn't complain. He simply tightened his circle and did the math of heat and time. That morning, he'd been at the edge of the clearing, setting a new brace on a fence post the last gale had bent. His gloves were rough leather, his movements economical. Ranger waited nearby with the patience of a sentry, occasionally stepping into fresh snow just to snap at a drifting flake and then acting like it was beneath his dignity. Jack almost smiled at that. Almost. It wasn't that Jack disliked people, it was that people came with questions, and questions came with memories. The last time he'd tried to live among them, he'd failed in a way that still tasted metallic in his throat. A drunk in town had decided to make a joke about Jack's service, and Jack's hand had moved faster than his brain. The man hadn't died, but he'd hit the floor hard enough to break a tooth, and the sheriff had looked at Jack with a mixture of pity and warning. "You can't be doing that, son. Not here. Not ever again." Jack had nodded like a good soldier, but something inside him had gone cold. He stopped going into town except for necessities. He kept his word short. He let his beard grow in as a soft barrier between himself and strangers, and then he started digging. The first time the idea came, it wasn't noble. It was not about heroism or preparedness. It came one night after a nightmare so vivid he woke tasting smoke and hearing screams that weren't in the room. He'd sat on the floor with his back against the bed, Ranger pressed against his hip, and he'd realized he didn't trust the walls. He didn't trust a single exit. He didn't trust that if something went wrong, fire, storm, men, he'd have a way out that wasn't a straight line into danger. A cabin, for all its charm, was still a wooden box in a world that burned. So he'd made another kind of box beneath it. It started with a careful square of floorboards near the back corner, where the stove's heat reached but curious eyes did not. He pried up planks, stacked them exactly as he found them, then cut into the packed earth beneath like a man carving his own secret. He dug when the ground was soft, and when it wasn't, he dug anyway. At first it was a pit, then it became a plan. His hands blistered, then toughened. His shoulders ached until they stopped complaining. Ranger watched every swing of the shovel as if supervising a construction crew. When Jack stopped to drink water, Ranger nudged his knee, reminding him that breaks were allowed. Over months, the pit deepened and shaped itself into something precise. Jack lined the walls with salvaged timber and sheet metal, built supports like ribs, and sealed cracks with tar and patience. He kept the footprint modest, just big enough for a man, a dog, and the supplies needed to outlast a bad stretch of winter. He called it the warm room in his head because it was always a few degrees kinder down there. The earth holding heat the way a hand holds a last match. The clever part, the part people mocked when they learned of it, was the second exit. Jack had picked a direction where the terrain fell slightly, then cut a narrow crawl tunnel that angled away from the cabin, beneath roots and stones, until it rose under the shelter of an old, fallen fir. The tree had crashed years ago in a storm and now lay like a giant's discarded spear, half buried, snow collecting in the hollow between trunk and ground. Jack created a hidden hatch under that hollow, framed with boards, covered with a slab of bark and a layer of forest debris he could replace in seconds. From the outside, it looked like nothing but winter's clutter. From inside, it was a promise. He added a vent pipe disguised beside the cabin's exterior painted dark, tucked behind a stack of cut wood, so air could move without advertising itself. To Jack, it wasn't paranoia. It was geometry. 2 exits were always better than 1. But when the first neighbor noticed the dirt piles, the whispers began. The nearest place with people was a small scattering of homes along the county road, men who cut timber, women who ran small farms, old couples who didn't trust the government and trusted the weather even less. They rarely came up to Jack's clearing, but they watched. They always watched. One of them was Sarah Whitlock. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, with a posture that made her look like she'd grown up carrying buckets and refusing to complain. Her hair was a sun-faded blonde, usually twisted into a messy bun under a wool hat, and her skin had the pale, freckled look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in front of a mirror. Her eyes were green and sharp, the kind that missed very little but chose kindness anyway. She ran a small roadside stop-half general store, half coffee counter down near the turnoff, and she was the sort of woman who remembered what brand of dog food you bought and asked about your roof before she asked about your day. People liked Sarah because she was practical, but also because her laughter didn't make you feel foolish. Jack wasn't people, not anymore, but Sarah still treated him like he belonged to the same species. She'd seen him in town before he disappeared, seen the set of his shoulders, the careful way he stood with his back to a wall, the way he'd flinched at a dropped pan in the diner. She'd heard the story about the broken tooth and the sheriff's talk. She didn't repeat it. That was part of her kindness. One afternoon, Sarah had driven up in her old blue pickup with a box of spare nails and a loaf of bread she claimed was extra. Jack had been sweating over a pile of boards, repairing the porch steps. Ranger had positioned himself between Jack and the truck, not aggressive but alert, eyes asking permission before trust. Sarah's smile had stayed soft. "I'm not here to bother you," she'd said, lifting the bread like an offering to a forest god. "Just figured you'd eat better than canned beans if someone reminded you what yeast tastes like." Jack had taken the bread with a nod, uncomfortable with gratitude. Ranger had sniffed Sarah's boots, then decided she wasn't worth barking at. Sarah looked past Jack toward the cabin, eyes catching the faint line where floorboards had been replaced. She didn't pry, not then. But towns have their own kind of wind, and rumors drift faster than snow. People started calling Jack Tunnel Jack. They said he was building a bunker for the end of the world. They laughed that he was afraid of storms like an old lady. Some said he was hiding gold. Others said he was hiding from the law. Jack didn't correct them. He'd learned that arguing with gossip was like shoveling during a blizzard. You could work all day and still lose by nightfall. Still, the laughter reached him sometimes, carried by the few times he went down for supplies. A man at the gas station had said, loud enough for everyone, "Hey, Mercer, you dig that hole deep enough to reach China yet?" Another had added, "Maybe he's making himself a grave, saves the trouble later." Jack hadn't reacted. He'd paid, loaded his truck, left. But inside, the words settled like grit. Not because they were cruel, Jack had been called worse in places that mattered more, but because they were careless. People mocked what they didn't understand. People mocked what they hoped they'd never need. Back at the cabin, Jack had gone to the hidden hatch beneath the fallen fir and checked it twice, then 3 times. Ranger had watched, tail still, ears forward. Jack had crouched and pressed his forehead to Ranger's, the way he did when the world felt loud even in silence. "If they laugh," Jack murmured, voice low, "it means they're still warm enough to laugh." Ranger huffed softly, as if unimpressed by philosophy but supportive of the sentiment. The storm forecast grew uglier by the hour. The air had that metallic heaviness that made lungs feel smaller. The sky turned the color of old tin, and the wind began to practice its teeth through the pines. Jack spent the late afternoon hauling extra wood inside, stacking it tight beside the stove. He filled the water barrels, checked the lanterns, counted the canned food like a miser counting coins. He laid a spare blanket in the warm room and placed Ranger's old chew toy down there as if to make the space smell like home. Then, as dusk bled into night, Jack did the one thing he always did before a storm. He tested his exits. He lifted the rug, slid a board, and opened the trapdoor. Warm air rose from the darkness below, earthy and faintly sweet, like the breath of a sleeping animal. Ranger trotted down the stairs ahead of him without hesitation, nails clicking softly on the wood. Jack followed, closing the hatch above them until the room became its own world, brick and timber, and quiet. He listened. The cabin creaked as the first real gust hit it. Snow began tapping the roof in a soft, insistent rhythm. Ranger sat near Jack's knee, posture alert but calm. Jack's mind tried to wander toward old scenes fire, shouting, the snap of radio chatter, but he forced it back. He wasn't there anymore. He was here. He had built something. He had done what he could with the tools in his hands. Jack ran his fingers along the tunnel wall, feeling the cold wood supports, the tight seams, the careful craft. He remembered the laughter. He remembered the word grave. And he thought, with a bitter humor that surprised even him, that if this was a grave, it was the most comfortable one he'd ever heard of. Ranger's ears flicked, his head lifted, not at the wind, not at the creak of settling wood. Something else. A sound that didn't belong to weather. A faint thud above, then another footsteps, urgent and uneven, as if someone was running and failing at it. Jack's throat tightened. Ranger stood, body suddenly coiled, staring up at the trapdoor as if it were the surface of a frozen lake that might crack. Jack killed the lantern to listen better. In the dark, the world narrowed to breath and sound. Above them, a muffled impact against the cabin wall, then a voice thin, through wood and storm, but human. "Please," it whispered, breaking on fear. "Help, help me." Jack's hand hovered near the ladder. He didn't move yet. He felt the old instincts rise like wolves. Trap, ambush, danger. But the voice had a pitch he recognized. Not the bravado of a con man, not the slur of a drunk, not the bark of a hunter. It sounded like someone trying not to die. Ranger let out a low, vibrating growl, not at the voice, but at the world that had brought it. Jack swallowed, tasting iron. The tunnel under his floor, the thing they mocked, waited like a held breath. And Jack, who had spent years building an escape from storms and men, realized the night had finally come when he might need it for someone else. He reached for the trapdoor latch. Ranger shifted beside him, ready. The cabin above creaked again, and the wind pressed harder, as if the forest itself leaned in to watch what Jack Mercer would do. The wind rose fast, not like weather changing, but like something deciding. Snow began to fly sideways, thin needles stinging Jack Mercer's face as he lifted the trapdoor just enough to listen. Above him, the cabin groaned, wood complaining under pressure, and beneath that noise clear as a snapped twig came hurried footsteps. Ranger's body went rigid beside him. The German shepherd's ears locked forward, every muscle drawn tight, a low growl vibrating from his chest, not loud enough to give away their position, but heavy with warning. Ranger did not growl at fear, he growled at intent. Jack closed the hatch silently and climbed the ladder in 2 controlled movements, his joints remembering drills his mind tried to forget. When he reached the cabin floor, he did not rush to the door. He moved to the window instead, peering through a narrow gap where frost hadn't yet claimed the glass. That was when he saw her. She burst from the tree line like a deer driven too far, stumbling into the clearing and nearly collapsing before she reached the porch. She was young late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a lean, athletic build that spoke of training rather than comfort. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a tight braid that had come loose, strands plastered to her face with sweat and melting snow. Her skin was pale beneath a wind-burned flush, lips already tinged blue from cold. She wore a police winter uniform navy jacket torn along one sleeve, shoulder patch half ripped away, the word "police" still visible but smeared with dirt and blood. Her right hand was pressed hard against her ribs, fingers shaking, blood seeping between them in dark pulses that steamed faintly in the freezing air. When she reached the door, she didn't knock. She leaned her forehead against the wood like it was the only thing holding her upright. Jack opened the door just enough to pull her inside, then shut it again immediately, sliding the heavy bolt home. The woman staggered forward, nearly fell, and Jack caught her by the arm. She was lighter than he expected, solid muscle under layers of wet fabric, trembling not just from cold, but from something deeper adrenaline draining too fast. Ranger circled them once, sniffing her boots, her hands, her coat, then stepped back and sat, eyes never leaving her face. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He watched. That alone told Jack more than words. "Sit," Jack said quietly, guiding her toward the chair near the stove. She obeyed without argument, collapsing into it, chest heaving. Her breathing sounded wrong, too shallow, too fast. Jack grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, his movements practiced, efficient. He had done this before, just not in this life. "Name," Jack said, not unkindly, but firm. "Emily," she managed. "Emily Carter." Her voice shook, but there was steel underneath it, the kind that didn't break easily. "Police officer?" Jack noticed the way she said it, not proud, not defensive, just factual, like stating a height or weight. He nodded once. "I know," he said. "Why are men chasing you through my woods?" Emily swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the windows as another gust rattled the cabin. "Because I found something I wasn't supposed to," she said, "and because the man who should have backed me up didn't." Jack crouched in front of her, keeping his face level with hers so she wouldn't have to crane her neck. He saw the details then, a bruise forming along her jaw, yellow already creeping in around purple, a shallow cut near her hairline crusted with blood, the way her left leg was stiff, favoring her right. She'd been running hurt. "Who?" Jack asked. Emily hesitated. That hesitation wasn't fear of Jack. It was the weight of betrayal. "Captain Nolan Hayes," she said finally. "My commanding officer." Jack didn't react outwardly, but something inside him clicked into place. Not surprise recognition. Men like Hayes existed everywhere. They wore authority like a shield and used it like a knife. "I was working a trafficking case," Emily continued, words tumbling faster now that she'd started. "Small at first. Cash seizures that didn't add up. Evidence disappearing. Informants going quiet. I thought it was sloppiness. Then I thought it was corruption. I didn't know how high it went until tonight." Her hands clenched in the blanket. "I recorded a meet, audio and video. Hayes was there. He wasn't even careful." She gave a short, humorless laugh that ended in a cough. "I think he thought loyalty meant silence." Jack stood and fetched his medical kit from a shelf, kneeling again to examine her side. He peeled her hand away gently, pressing gauze to the wound. It wasn't a gunshot too ragged, too shallow. "Knife?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Glancing. I got lucky." Jack taped the dressing tight, firm but careful. "You won't if you stay exposed," he said. Ranger moved closer, placing his head against Emily's knee. She flinched, then relaxed when he didn't move away. She reached down automatically, fingers brushing his fur. Ranger accepted the touch with a quiet dignity, eyes flicking back to Jack as if asking permission. Jack gave a small nod. "They know I'm here," Emily said suddenly. "They tracked me. I lost one vehicle on the ridge, but they split up. They'll check cabins, any place with light." As if summoned by her words, distant engine noise cut through the storm, a low rumble, then another, circling wide. Headlights flashed briefly between trees like predatory eyes. Jack straightened, mind already running angles and distances. He had chosen this place because it was forgotten. He had underestimated how hard desperate men could look. "How many?" he asked. "At least 3, Emily said. "Maybe more. They're not wearing uniforms. Contractors. Ex-military, I think. They move like it." Jack's jaw tightened. "Figures," he said. Ranger's growl returned, deeper now, vibrating through the floorboards as footsteps approached the clearing, slow, deliberate, testing. Someone knocked once, hard, on the cabin door. Not polite, not friendly. A voice followed, male, calm in a way that felt rehearsed. "Police," it called. "We're looking for a missing officer. Open up." Emily's eyes widened. "That's not Hayes," she whispered. "That's one of his men." Jack didn't answer. He moved to the stove and kicked ash over the fire, plunging the cabin into dim lantern light. He reached down, lifted the rug, and slid the concealed board aside. The trapdoor handle emerged like a secret. Ranger moved instantly, positioning himself between Emily and the door, body tense, ready. "There's a space under the floor," Jack said quietly. "It's warm. It's hidden. You can't hesitate." Emily stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. "You have a bunker?" Jack gave a thin smile. "Tunnel," he corrected. Another knock harder this time. "Last warning," the voice outside said. "We don't want to make this difficult." Jack met Emily's gaze. In that moment, something passed between them that didn't need explanation, a shared understanding that the world had narrowed to choices and consequences. Emily nodded once. She trusted him, not because she knew him, but because she had learned what betrayal looked like, and Jack Mercer didn't wear that face. He helped her to her feet and guided her down the ladder. Ranger went first, silent as breath, then Emily, then Jack, closing the hatch above them and sliding the board back into place until the floor was whole again. Darkness swallowed them, warm and close. The pounding above resumed boots now, moving across the cabin, testing walls, rattling the door. Jack lit the lantern low. Emily leaned against the timber wall, breathing steadier now, eyes adjusting. "How long?" she whispered. Jack listened, counting footsteps, measuring weight. "Long enough," he said. Above them, something heavy struck the cabin wall. Wood cracked. A voice cursed. Another laughed. The storm howled, eager to cover the sound. Ranger pressed against Jack's leg, calm but ready, his presence anchoring the moment. Jack felt the earth around them, solid and patient, holding their heat like a promise. The tunnel he had built to escape storms and memories now sheltered a woman carrying truth powerful enough to burn men alive. And Jack Mercer, who had sworn never to involve himself again, understood with a cold clarity that hiding was no longer an option, only choosing when and how to emerge. The lantern's low flame painted the tunnel walls amber as Emily Carter reached inside her jacket with careful fingers. The movement deliberate, protective, like someone touching a wound that could kill if mishandled. Jack Mercer watched her hands more than her face, noting the tremor she fought to control, the way discipline held panic at bay. She drew out a small black USB drive, first ordinary, scuffed at the corners, the kind of thing a person might lose between couch cushions, and then a folded scrap of paper, stiff with dried blood. When she unfolded it, Jack saw the red-brown stains haloing a grid of handwriting, dates, times, amounts, coordinates, and a signature written in a confident, looping hand that carried authority in every stroke. Emily didn't need to read it aloud. The name sat there like a verdict. Captain Nolan Hayes. Jack felt the cold settle deeper than the storm outside. Hayes was not a ghost or a rumor. He was the kind of man whose face belonged on plaques and press releases. Emily spoke quietly, each word measured. Hayes had been tall and immaculate, she said, silver threaded neatly through black hair, beard trimmed to regulation perfection, a jawline that suggested decisiveness rather than cruelty. He shook hands like he meant it. He listened like he cared. He had built a reputation on calm leadership during crises, the sort that made younger officers feel safe and older ones feel validated. That was the trick. He never raised his voice. He never rushed. He let other people make mistakes and then used those mistakes like leverage. Emily had admired him once, not hero worship, but respect earned through years of seeing him handle ugly situations with an even hand. The first crack came when a witness vanished and Hayes told her to stop digging. The second came when evidence logged into the system reappeared altered, then vanished entirely. The third came tonight, when she followed a paper trail off the books to a meet she thought would net a mid-level broker, and instead found her own captain waiting, flanked by men who wore their experience like scars beneath civilian coats. Emily's voice stayed steady as she described the moment Hayes realized she was recording him. The flicker of annoyance, not fear, the casual nod to one of his men, the knife that slid between her ribs as if it were a correction rather than an attack. She escaped because a door was unlocked that shouldn't have been, and because she ran harder than pain. Jack listened without interruption, filing details away, his mind mapping consequences. He had known men like Hayes in another life, men who believed outcomes justified methods, men who convinced themselves they were the thin line holding chaos back while quietly profiting from the disorder. Outside, Ranger's nails clicked softly against the wooden floor above them as he paced, sniffing the air drawn down through the vent. The dog's breathing changed, slow, becoming sharp, a low sound building in his chest that Jack recognized as Ranger's assessment of threat. Jack glanced up at the ceiling as if he could see through it. Engines idled in the distance, not roaring, not hurried patient. "They're spacing themselves," Jack murmured. Listening. Emily nodded. "They won't rush," she said. "They don't have to." She tucked the USB into the inside pocket of her shirt and folded the paper smaller, sliding it into the seam of her jacket, where a lining tear hid it from casual searches. Jack noted the care. She was not reckless. She was thorough. That was probably why Hayes wanted her gone. Jack thought of the laughter in town, the jokes about his tunnel, and felt a bitter gratitude. If Emily had reached any other cabin tonight, she would already be dead. The tunnel hummed faintly with the sound of the storm, wind forced through branches, snow ticking against wood. Jack leaned closer to the ladder and listened. Above them, boots crossed the room. A drawer slid open. Another, a cupboard banged shut. A voice spoke, low and amused, commenting on the rustic charm. Another voice answered with a laugh that carried no warmth. Jack pictured the men in their late 30s to 40s, broad-shouldered, careful with their weight, faces shaved too clean, or beards worn with intention, the look of people who trained together and trusted systems more than instincts. One of them struck the wall again, harder this time. Testing. Wood cracked. The cabin groaned. Emily flinched, despite herself. Jack put a hand up, palm open, grounding. "They'll find nothing," he whispered. "The hatch is invisible." He didn't say the part he couldn't guarantee, that invisibility only worked until someone decided to burn everything. Ranger's growl deepened. The sound carried through the floor like a warning drum. Jack felt a flash of heat anger, old and dangerous, but he tamped it down. Anger made noise. Noise got people killed. He focused instead on choices. He could keep them hidden, hope the men outside decided the storm was punishment enough and left. Or he could prepare for the inevitable escalation. Hayes would not leave loose ends. Men like Hayes did not tolerate variables. Emily shifted her weight, wincing as pain flared. She met Jack's eyes, reading the same calculus. "If they torch the place," she said softly, "the tunnel will fill with smoke." Jack nodded. "For a while," he said. "Not if we move." He explained the second exit in a few sentences, how it angled away under roots, how the hatch lay beneath a fallen fir where snow piled deep, how the wind would help mask scent and sound. Emily's brows lifted, the first sign of hope breaking through exhaustion. "You planned this," she said. Jack shrugged. "I planned not to die in a box," he replied. Above them, the men finished their cursory search and regrouped near the door. One voice spoke again, closer now to the stove. "He's not here," it said. "Or he ran." Another voice, sharper, replied, "Check again." A pause. Then a third voice, calm and bored, delivered the sentence Jack had been waiting for. "Light it." Emily's breath hitched. Jack's hand closed into a fist, then opened. He reached down and rested his fingers briefly in Ranger's fur, feeling the steady warmth there. Ranger looked up at him, eyes bright, waiting. Jack leaned toward Emily. "When the smoke starts," he said, "we go. Slow and quiet until we're clear. Then we move fast." Emily nodded, jaw set. She had already decided. The lantern flickered as air shifted. A faint tang reached Jack's nose fuel. The first lick of heat pressed down through the floor, a subtle change, then stronger. The cabin above them began to tick and pop as cold wood met sudden flame. Smoke crept through the vent, thin at first. Jack extinguished the lantern and let darkness settle, trusting his hands and memory. He counted heartbeats, listening to the men outside curse as wind fought their fire, listening to Ranger's breathing steady, listening to Emily draw herself inward around the evidence she carried. The tunnel, mocked and hidden, held them like a held breath. Jack Mercer understood then that the night had crossed a line. This was no longer about surviving a storm. It was about choosing whether truth burned with the house or slipped into the woods alive. He placed his hand on the ladder, feeling the vibration of heat above, and prepared to open the path he had built for exactly this moment. Fire announced itself before flames did. It arrived as a smell-sharp, chemical, wrong seeping down through the seams of the cabin floor and into the tunnel like a warning whispered by the earth itself. Jack Mercer felt it before he saw it, a tightening behind the eyes, the instinct that had once told him when to move before a blast wave arrived. Above them, boots thudded with new purpose. The men had stopped searching and started deciding. Ranger paused halfway down the tunnel, head lifted, nostrils flaring. His hackles rose along his spine, black and tan fur bristling as the heat above intensified. He did not bark. He looked back at Jack instead, eyes bright in the low light, waiting for the signal he trusted more than any sound. Emily Carter moved carefully behind him, one hand sliding along the timber wall to steady herself. Her breathing had evened out, controlled now, the way officers are trained to breathe when panic wants the wheel. Sweat darkened her hairline despite the cold, strands of her brown hair clinging to her temples. The pain in her side burned sharper as adrenaline shifted, but she kept her jaw locked, refusing to give it voice. Jack reached the junction where the tunnel narrowed, the point where choice became direction. He knelt, sliding a panel aside to reveal the angled crawlway that led away from the cabin, sloping gently upward toward the forest. "This is it," he whispered. "Once we're through, we don't stop until the trees swallow us." Emily nodded, eyes flicking once toward the ceiling as a heavy impact shook dust loose. Someone laughed above them, short, ugly, confident, a man enjoying certainty. Jack felt his mouth tighten. He had heard that laugh before in other throats, other places. It always meant someone thought the story was already finished. Ranger went first, lowering himself into the crawlway with practiced ease, shoulders rippling as he pushed forward. Emily followed, slower, wincing as her injured side scraped the narrow passage. Jack brought up the rear, sliding the panel back into place behind them, erasing the last sign of their path. The crawlway was tight, intentionally so. Jack had built it for concealment, not comfort. Earth pressed close, the scent of damp soil and roots thick in the air. Above them, the cabin groaned again, this time deeper, angrier. The first real flames had taken hold. Wood cracked like knuckles. Smoke began to chase them, thin and gray at first, then heavier, the taste of it bitter on Jack's tongue. He counted breaths, measured distance by memory. 10 feet, 20, 30. The tunnel curved slightly left, then right, following the logic of roots and stone. Ranger paused once, ears swiveling, then continued. Jack trusted the dog's sense more than his own vision in the dark. The tunnel ended beneath the fallen fir, its massive trunk resting at an angle like a bridge built by accident. Jack reached up and pushed the hidden hatch with careful pressure. Snow slid down in a soft rush, spilling into the tunnel, clean and cold. Night air poured in behind it, sharp enough to sting lungs but blessedly free of smoke. Ranger emerged first, silent as a thought, then Emily, then Jack. He pulled the hatch closed and dragged bark and snow back into place, restoring the forest's illusion. From a distance, the fallen tree looked untouched, just another casualty of past storms. They crouched there for a moment, letting the wind erase their presence. The blizzard had thickened, snow blowing sideways in white sheets that reduced the world to 10 feet of visibility. Perfect cover. Jack took in their surroundings with a soldier's eye, the slope of the land, the direction of the wind, the dark smudge of trees offering concealment. He motioned, and they moved. They did not run at first. Running left patterns. They moved at a hard, steady walk, angling downhill toward a frozen creek Jack knew cut through the lower timber. Ice would hold scent poorly, and water even frozen confused tracking. Ranger ranged ahead and back, a living compass, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, then adjusting course with a flick of his tail. Behind them, the cabin burned. Flames clawed through the roof, bright orange against the storm, smoke boiling upward only to be torn apart by wind. Shouts followed, angry now, disbelieving. A gunshot cracked once, then again, wild and useless. The men had realized too late. Emily glanced back only once, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "You lost everything," she said, voice barely audible over the wind. Jack shook his head. "I kept what matters," he replied, and nudged her forward. The creek appeared as a darker line beneath drifting snow. Jack tested the ice with a boot, then waved them on. They moved across it in a staggered line, feet sliding carefully, Ranger light and sure. Halfway across, headlights cut through the storm from the ridge above. Vehicles repositioning, engines revving. One of the men shouted, pointing toward the burning cabin, then toward the tree line. They were spreading out. Jack felt the hunt begin. They reached the far bank and disappeared into the trees just as a beam of light swept across the ice. Ranger froze, body pressed low, then eased forward when the light passed. The forest thickened, branches clawing at coats, snow dumping down collars. Emily stumbled once, caught herself, teeth clenched against pain. Jack steadied her without breaking stride. He could feel fatigue creeping in, that dangerous softness at the edges of awareness, but he pushed it back. Survival was a series of small refusals. A shape loomed ahead, an old hunting shack half buried in snow, little more than a lean-to left by someone who never came back. Jack paused, assessing. Shelter meant warmth, but also risk. He shook his head. They kept moving. Minutes stretched. The wind screamed. Then a new sound cut through it, a voice calling Jack's name. Not the harsh bark of the hunters, but a familiar cadence, sharp with worry. "Jack!" Ranger's ears snapped up. Jack stopped short, heart slamming. From the trees ahead emerged Sarah Whitlock, her tall, wiry frame wrapped in a heavy parka-dusted white. Her blonde hair had escaped its usual bun, whipping around her freckled face, cheeks red from cold. She carried a flashlight and a rifle slung awkwardly over her shoulder, the way someone does who knows how to use one but hopes not to. Sarah had come up the mountain when the storm hit, driven by that practical kindness that never waited for permission. She froze when she saw Emily, eyes narrowing, taking in the torn uniform, the blood. "What happened?" she demanded, voice steady despite the fear flickering beneath it. Jack didn't explain everything. He didn't have to. "We're being hunted," he said. "They burned the cabin." Sarah's jaw tightened. Something old and fierce settled into her expression, the look of a woman who had grown up learning that the world could turn ugly fast and that hesitation cost more than action. "My place is 2 miles east," she said. "Cellar under the storehouse, stone walls, no lights." Emily shook her head. "They'll check any known shelter," she said. "Then we don't stay," she said. "We move through." Headlights flared again behind them, closer now. Shouts followed, sharper, coordinated. The net was tightening. Jack weighed options, then nodded. "You lead," he told Sarah. "Ranger will cover our back." Sarah didn't argue. She turned and moved, long strides eating distance despite the snow. Ranger fell in behind Emily, glancing back toward the approaching lights, then forward again, balancing vigilance with trust. They moved as one unit now, strangers bound by necessity. The forest opened briefly into a clearing, and for a heartbeat Jack feared exposure, but the storm swallowed them, white chaos erasing outlines. A gunshot snapped, closer this time. Snow burst from a tree trunk inches from where Jack had been. He shoved Emily forward, shouting once, a sharp command that Ranger obeyed instantly. The dog darted sideways, breaking into the open, drawing attention with a flash of movement. Shouts followed, light swinging after him. Jack's chest tightened, but he trusted Ranger's judgment. Seconds later, the dog reappeared on the other side of the clearing, silent again. Having pulled the hunters off their line just long enough, they plunged back into the trees. At last the ground rose, rockier here, footing treacherous. Jack felt his lungs burn, his legs shake. Emily faltered, nearly fell, and Jack caught her, supporting more of her weight now. Sarah slowed to match them, her face set with grim determination. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter, the storm reclaiming sound. Jack did not let himself believe it yet. He knew better than to assume mercy. When they finally reached a narrow ravine choked with snow and brush, Jack signaled a stop. They slid down into it, crouching beneath overhangs of ice and rock. From above, only darkness and snow. They waited, listening to the storm breathe. Minutes passed. No voices, no engines, just wind and the distant crackle of a burning cabin far behind them. Jack leaned back against cold stone, eyes closing for a single count of 3. He opened them again, alert. The tunnel had done its job. It had given them distance, time, a chance. But the night was not finished with them yet. The fire took the cabin the way a verdict takes a breath final, unarguable, hungry. From the ravine were Jack Mercer, Emily Carter, Sarah Whitlock, and Ranger crouched beneath ice-lipped stone. The blaze painted the storm with a savage orange pulse that throbbed through blowing snow. Wind tore sparks into ribbons, flinging them into the trees like frantic prayers. Jack watched without blinking. He had expected grief. What he felt instead was a clean, cold resolve. The tunnel had done what it was built to do. It had bought time, distance, and a choice. Above the roar of the storm came the distant crack of timber surrendering. Sarah's jaw tightened as she followed Jack's gaze. She was tall and spare, all bone and tendon under her parka, with freckled skin gone ruddy from cold and eyes that learned quickly where to look and where not to. She had grown up watching storms ruin careful plans. She didn't flinch at loss, but she catalogued it. Emily leaned back against the rock, breathing shallow, the pain in her side beginning to throb as adrenaline ebbed. Jack knelt beside her, checked the dressing by touch, nodded once. "We can't stay," he said, voice low. "Heat draws eyes, and men who set fires don't leave questions unanswered." Ranger's ears twitched at the word men, amber eyes fixed on the tree line. He shifted his weight, alert but patient, a veteran of silence. They moved again, this time angling north where the land rose into knuckled ridges and the wind scoured scent into confusion. Snow thickened, visibility collapsing to a few steps at a time. Jack led by memory, choosing ground that forced single file, narrowing pursuit. Sarah took point when the slope steepened, long strides testing ice before weight committed. She moved like someone used to carrying responsibility without comment. Emily followed, teeth clenched, refusing help until her foot slipped on glare ice and Jack caught her elbow. She met his eyes, a flicker of anger at her own limits, then nodded and accepted his shoulder. They crested a low ridge and dropped into a stand of younger pines where branches sagged with snow, forming a tunnel of white. There, Jack stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips and listened. The storm spoke in 100 voices, wind, snapping boughs, the distant echo of engines idling far below. Then another sound threaded through it, thin and human. A shout, angry and confused. The hunters were spreading wider. "They'll try to cut us off downhill," Sarah whispered. "My cellar won't help if they're patient." Jack nodded. "We won't give them patience." He reached into his pack and pulled a small, flare-old, reliable, meant for emergencies he'd hoped never to meet. He weighed it once, then handed it to Sarah. "When I say," he murmured. Ranger glanced up, tail low but steady. Jack placed a hand on the dog's ruff, feeling the familiar warmth, the certainty. "You remember the creek bend?" Jack asked Sarah. She nodded. "With the deadfall?" "There," Jack said. "We'll make noise they can't ignore." They moved until the trees thinned and the ground fell sharply toward a frozen cut in the land. Jack raised a fist. Sarah struck the flare and hurled it downslope. It burst into violent red light, sizzling as it bounced across ice and snow, painting shadows that looked like running men. Jack waited 3 heartbeats, then whistled once sharp, commanding. Ranger broke left in a blur, paused silent, drawing attention with the memory of motion. Shouts erupted immediately. Lights swung, engines revved, men committed. Jack hauled Emily forward, Sarah close behind, and they slipped right, back into the timber where the storm erased edges. They ran until lungs burned and legs shook, then slowed to a punishing walk, conserving breath. The ground here was rockier, less forgiving, and Jack felt the old ache in his knee, the souvenir of a roadside explosion that had taught him pain could be negotiated, not obeyed. He negotiated now. When at last the lights fell away behind them and the forest swallowed sound again, Jack guided them into a shallow cave no bigger than a pantry, its mouth hidden by a curtain of ice. Inside, the air was still, the cold absolute. They huddled, sharing heat, listening to the storm finish what the fire had begun. Time passed in measured breaths. Emily's shivering eased as Jack wrapped her tighter, his movements careful, professional. She studied his face in the half-dark, the disciplined beard, the eyes that had learned to look past the obvious. "You didn't hesitate," she said softly, "when you opened that hatch." Jack considered the question. "I built it so I wouldn't," he replied. Above them, the wind screamed, then slowly, grudgingly, began to tire. When the first gray hint of dawn pressed through the storm, Jack made the call to move. They descended into the valley where the road snaked like a scar. The hunters had withdrawn to regroup, leaving tracks that led nowhere useful. Sarah guided them to her place by back paths, a squat storehouse of stone and timber, its cellar dug deep, walls thick enough to muffle sound. Inside, the air smelled of earth and apples. Sarah lit no lamps. She fetched blankets, water, a battered first aid kit that had seen more than its share of accidents. Jack cleaned Emily's wound properly this time, stitches neat and sure. Emily watched his hands. "You were a medic," she said. "Among other things," Jack replied. Ranger settled by the door, content but vigilant. They stayed long enough for Emily to rest and for Jack to plan the next step. The evidence couldn't sit. The men who burned the cabin would hunt until they were stopped. "We go public," Emily said, voice steadier now. "Federal. Tonight." Jack nodded. "We'll move at dusk," he said. "Different route." Sarah met his eyes. "You'll need a car," she said. "Mine." Jack didn't argue. He knew when to accept help. As daylight strengthened, news traveled the way it always did in small places, by rumor and smoke. Someone would talk about the fire. Someone would ask why. Jack packed what little he had left: maps, a spare coat, the memory of a warm room that still existed beneath ash. He took one last look at Sarah's cellar, then at Emily, who stood straighter now, pain folded away around purpose. The tunnel had lived, the house had burned. The truth was moving. Dawn never truly arrived. It merely thinned the dark into a gray that made distance lie. Jack Mercer led them from the shelter of stone and timber into a world scrubbed raw by wind, the snow falling thick enough to forgive footprints almost as soon as they were made. He chose the line of a frozen creek not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Ice remembered nothing for long, and moving water beneath it muddled scent the way lies muddle truth. Ranger trotted ahead with his head low, black saddle dusted white, tail level, the picture of purpose. The dog's age showed only impatience now. 8 winters had taught him when speed mattered and when restraint kept a pack alive. Emily Carter followed close behind Jack, her gait stiff but determined, dark hair braided tight again, jaws set in that way officers learned when pain tried to negotiate. Sarah Whitlock brought up the rear, tall and spare, rifle slung but unused, eyes flicking to the tree line and back, cataloging risk like inventory. The creek narrowed, then widened, its surface crazed with spiderweb cracks that sang under their weight. Jack tested each step, angled them where the wind scoured the ice clean and erased edges. He knew the men behind them would fan out now that they'd found no bodies at the fire. Hunters who discovered a kill missing always assumed it had learned to run. They heard the engines before they saw them, throaty, impatient, not quite synchronized. Then lights pierced the gray, slicing between trunks. Shouts followed, sharper than before, and with them the discipline of men who had stopped improvising. Jack motioned them up the bank, where the creek bent hard left under a shelf of rock. He whispered instructions without turning. "We split for 30 seconds, he said. "Noise wins us space." Ranger glanced back, eyes bright, already understanding. Jack tapped 2 fingers against his thigh. The dog bolted across the open ice, paws skidding theatrically. A deliberate mistake to draw eyes. A beam caught him instantly. "There!" someone yelled, voice hoarse with certainty. Shots cracked, too quick, too wild, and ice burst where Ranger had been a heartbeat before. The dog vanished into brush, silent again. Jack hauled Emily up the bank and pushed through spruce saplings that grabbed at coats and skin. Sarah took a different angle, circling wide with the economy of someone who had learned to make herself scarce when trouble wanted witnesses. They moved downhill now, into a wind corridor where gusts tore the snow sideways and scrubbed tracks to rumor. Jack felt the old burn in his lungs, the negotiation with limits he'd practiced long ago. He kept his breath measured, counting steps, refusing the panic that wasted oxygen. A new voice rose behind them, close enough to taste deep, amused, unhurried. "You're good," it called. "But you're tired." Jack recognized the tone even without a face. Men who enjoyed the chase always thought it made them honest. A shape detached from the trees ahead, a hunter stepping into view with a calm that telegraphed experience. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, beard trimmed, short and squared, eyes pale and appraising beneath a knit cap pulled low. His parka was civilian, but cut to allow movement. His rifle hung easy, not raised, because confidence liked to pretend it didn't need urgency. This was Grant Harlow. Jack did not know the name yet, but he knew the type. The kind of contractor who had learned violence as a trade and morality as a rumor, who spoke politely while closing doors. "Drop the pack," Harlow said, nodding toward Emily. "You can walk away." Emily's hand tightened inside her coat, fingers closing over the USB like a talisman. Jack stepped half a pace forward, presenting himself as the problem. He felt Ranger reappear at his left, ghost quiet, hackles low, waiting. Wind ripped between them, carrying the smell of cold metal and gasoline. Jack did not answer. He lifted his gaze past Harlow's shoulder to the slope behind him and counted shadows. Too many. They were closing the net again. Jack made the decision he had built his life around since the day a blast had taught him how small a margin could be. He reached down and unclipped the pack from Emily's shoulders in one smooth motion, tossed it sideways into the brush and shouted, "Ranger!" The dog launched, not at Harlow but past him, exploding through the trees with a racket that sounded like panic. Harlow flinched, instinct overriding calculation, head snapping to follow motion. Jack took the opening and moved hard and fast, driving Emily downslope into the wind corridor. A shot barked, close enough to buzz Jack's ear. Snow sprayed. They ran blind for 10 seconds, then Jack cut sharply right where the ground fell into a shallow ravine veined with alder. Sarah materialized ahead, breathless but steady, eyes fierce. "This way," she said, and slid down on her heels, controlled, disappearing into the dip. Jack followed, half carrying Emily now as the pain stole her rhythm. At the bottom, the ravine twisted, a series of bends that turned sound back on itself. Jack forced them to stop beneath a tangle of roots where the wind howled overhead but could not see. They pressed flat, counting breaths. Footsteps passed above one set, then another, then faded. Ranger returned moments later, tongue lolling, eyes alive with the joy of a job done right. Jack pressed his forehead briefly to the dogs, gratitude sharp and wordless. They did not linger. When they moved again, it was with purpose and patience, angling toward a logging spur Sarah knew would lead them to a dead end for vehicles and a clean break for feet. The snow began to ease, the sky lifting by degrees, and with it the sense of pursuit thinned. By late afternoon they reached a stand of burned timber from an old fire, blackened trunks rising like ribs. Jack chose the place deliberately. Ash confused scent, and the openness punished careless movement. They crossed without haste, Ranger ranging wide, then dropped into the far tree line, where the world softened again. When at last Jack allowed them to stop, he leaned against a fir and closed his eyes for 3 counts. Emily slid down beside him, face pale but resolute. "They'll keep coming," she said. Jack nodded. "So will we," he replied. He looked north where the land opened toward roads and radios and witnesses. The chase had stripped choices down to essentials, and essentials pointed forward. The forest thinned as night returned, not gently but with purpose, the sky flattening into a low ceiling of iron-gray cloud that pressed sound close to the ground. Jack Mercer chose the place with care. A shallow bowl between ridge lines where wind swept snow clean in long, honest strokes, and sight lines opened just enough to punish lies. He had learned in another life that truth needed space to breathe, and witnesses. Emily Carter stood beside him, posture straighter now despite the ache stitched into her side, her face sharpened by resolve. In the half-light, she looked younger than her badge suggested and older than her years required, the kind of woman whose trust had been broken once and would never be handed out again without proof. Her dark eyes were steady, hair rebraided tight against her scalp, cheeks hollowed slightly by cold and fatigue. Sarah Whitlock moved quietly at the perimeter, tall and spare as a winter reed, freckles ghosted pale against wind-burned skin. She kept her rifle slung, not raised. Her strength lay in watching angles, not announcing herself. Ranger sat at Jack's heel, black and tan coat dusted white, breath puffing slow and calm, eyes tracking every shift of shadow. Jack handed Emily the old handheld radio he'd salvaged years ago, its casing scarred but reliable, the kind of tool that refused to quit because it had never known luxury. Emily keyed the mic, voice low, controlled, and spoke the words that would set the hook. She used the language of greed and certainty, the coordinates pulled from memory, and the USB, the promise of a clean exchange, a final chance to make things right. She named the buyer they all knew existed but never met. She named the time. She named the place. Then she waited. Minutes stretched, the wind riding over their footprints, the forest holding its breath. Jack used the time to work. He planted the small trail camera Sarah had brought from her storehouse, a weather-beaten thing meant for elk counts, angling it across the bowl where headlights would betray themselves. He set the locator beacon in a pocket of rock, its signal faint but precise, the kind federal receivers could find if they were looking. He clipped a mic to Emily's collar beneath her coat, tested the gain, nodded once. "Say nothing you don't want remembered," he said. Emily's mouth curved in a thin, humorless smile. "I want all of it remembered," she replied. When the engines came, they came as expected, unhurried, confident, cutting through the wind with the assurance of men who believed the story was already finished. Headlights flared at the rim of the bowl, then dimmed as vehicles idled into position. Doors opened. Boots crunched. A familiar silhouette stepped forward, tall and immaculate even here. Captain Nolan Hayes. He wore a dark parka tailored to move, beard trimmed to regulation neatness, hair silvered just enough to sell authority. His face held the same calm Emily remembered from briefings and commendations, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being believed. Behind him fanned two contractors, one broad and blunt, the other lean and watchful men whose eyes measured distance and opportunity with professional detachment. Hayes's voice carried without effort. "Emily," he called, as if greeting a colleague late to a meeting, "you've caused quite a mess." Emily stepped into the open, pain flaring as she straightened, refusing to let it show. "You tried to kill me," she said. Hayes sighed, a performance of regret. "You misunderstood," he replied. "You threatened the integrity of the department." Jack watched Hayes's hands, the slight flecks of fingers that betrayed impatience. Men like Hayes believed their intentions purified their actions. He let Emily speak, let the rope unspool. She accused. Hayes corrected. She named dates and sums. Hayes countered with rhetoric and authority. Then he made the mistake Jack had counted on. Certainty curdled into command. "Enough," Hayes said, voice hardening. He lifted a hand, two fingers snapping once. "End this." The contractors moved. Emily's mic caught the words clean and sharp. The camera blinked red. Jack stepped from cover, rifle raised but not fired, his presence a variable Hayes had not budgeted. Ranger rose beside him, silent and immense. Hayes's eyes flicked, calculating, then narrowed. "Who are you?" he demanded. Jack met his gaze, the old steadiness settling in. "Someone who doesn't confuse order with justice," he said. Sirens rose in the distance then. First a rumor, then a certainty, cutting through the wind like a verdict spoken aloud. Red and blue light pulsed faintly against cloud. Hayes' face changed at last, composure cracking to reveal anger and disbelief. He took one step back, then another, as if distance might undo sound. "You think this ends me?" he spat. Emily's voice was calm when she answered, "I think it ends your lies." The contractors froze, hands hovering between choices. When federal vehicles crested the ridge, Hayes's shoulders slumped a fraction, the weight of inevitability finally landing. Jack lowered his rifle, but did not relax until cuffs clicked and Hayes was turned away, still protesting, still convinced someone had misunderstood his greatness. As agents secured the scene, Emily exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Her knees threatened to buckle. Jack steadied her. Ranger pressed close, warmth and certainty in fur and breath. Snow fell softer now, as if the forest approved. Jack watched haze disappear into flashing light and felt no triumph, only a quiet closing of a door. The truth had walked into the open and survived. That would have to be enough. Morning arrived quietly, as if ashamed of what the night had revealed. The forest wore a fresh skin of snow, thin and deliberate, laid gently over tire ruts, footprints, and the dark truth that had clawed its way into the open. Jack Mercer stood at the edge of what used to be his cabin and watched steam rise from the ruins like a ghost that hadn't decided whether to stay or leave. The fire had done its work thoroughly. Blackened beams collapsed inward, nails twisted like broken fingers, the stove reduced to a warped shell half buried in ash. The smell lingered, burnt resin, wet charcoal. Loss. Ranger padded forward, sniffed once, then turned away, tail low but steady. Dogs understood endings better than people. Emily Carter arrived with the federal agents an hour later, her steps careful, posture composed in the way of someone who had decided not to fall apart until it was convenient. She wore borrowed clothes now, Sarah's spare jacket hanging loose on her lean frame, sleeves too long, collar brushing her chin. Her face looked thinner in daylight, eyes darker, but there was a new stillness there, a weight that came from certainty replacing fear. She did not look at the wreckage for long. Instead, she looked at Jack, then at the patch of ground beside the ruins where the trapdoor lay hidden beneath ash and snow. "It's still there," she said softly. Jack nodded. He had checked already. Beneath the ruin, beneath the smoke and memory, the tunnel waited intact, warm, patient. The agents worked methodically, voices low, radios murmuring confirmations. One of them approached Jack, a man in his early 40s with a square build and tired eyes, his beard threaded with gray that suggested too many winters spent asking the wrong people the right questions. His name was Thomas Reed, Special Agent, and he carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone who had learned that victories were rarely clean. "Mr. Mercer," Reed said, offering a hand. Jack shook it once. "Your cooperation saved lives," Reed continued, "and ended something that's been rotting for years." Jack shrugged. Praise slid off him easily. Reed glanced toward Emily, then back. "You don't want anything?" he asked. Jack thought about it, about rebuilding, about compensation, about recognition. He shook his head. "I want to be left alone," he said. Reed nodded as if he'd expected no other answer. Emily spoke with Reed next, her voice calm, precise, recounting facts without embellishment. When it was done, she stepped away, breath fogging the air, and leaned against a snow-dusted stump. Sarah Whitlock stood nearby, arms crossed, freckles stark against pale skin, blonde hair tucked under a knit cap pulled low. She watched Emily with a practical concern that didn't ask permission. "You're going to be all right," Sarah said. Emily considered that, then nodded once. "Eventually," she replied. The word held honesty without despair. Later, when the agents departed and the forest reclaimed its quiet, Jack returned to the tunnel. He lifted the hidden hatch and descended alone, lantern casting soft light on timber and earth. The warm room smelled as it always had. Soil, wood, a trace of smoke that would fade. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the solid truth of it. This place had been mocked, dismissed as paranoia, called a grave. Instead, it had been a womb-sheltering truth, until it could be born into daylight. He sat on the step for a while, listening to nothing. When he climbed back out, Ranger waited, tail thumping once against the snow. Emily stood nearby, watching him with an expression Jack had seen in mirrors before, someone deciding whether to stay or go. "I can't wear the badge the same way again," she said. "Maybe not at all." Jack considered her, the resolve and fracture coexisting in her posture. "Badges are tools," he said. "They're only as good as the hands that hold them." Emily smiled faintly. "You sound like you've thought about that." "I've thought about a lot of things underground," Jack replied. Sarah snorted softly at that, then grew serious. "You're not staying here," she said to Jack. It wasn't a question. Jack looked at the ruins, then at the trees beyond. "I'm not done," he said. "Just changing ground." That afternoon, Emily knelt beside Ranger and wrapped her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in his fur. Ranger accepted the embrace with solemn dignity, then licked her cheek once, as if sealing a pact. Jack watched, a rare smile tugging at his mouth, dry and surprised. "I dug a tunnel to hide from storms," he said quietly. "Didn't expect it to hide the truth long enough to save it." Emily looked up. "Sometimes," she said, "the safest place for the truth is underground." Snow began to fall again, light, steady, forgiving. The forest absorbed the last of the night's violence, and beneath the ash, beneath the snow, the earth held its warmth. Jack Mercer did not become a hero. He did not seek forgiveness or fame. He rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, carrying forward a simple vow spoken only to himself and a dog who understood. When fire comes to erase the truth, he would dig deeper, stand longer, and let the ground remember what men tried to forget. Sometimes God does not send a miracle from the sky. Sometimes He hides it beneath our feet. A tunnel dug in silence, a door mocked by others, a choice made long before the fire came. When the flames rose and truth was hunted, the earth itself became shelter, and in that quiet darkness, life was preserved not by chance, but by preparation, courage, and faith. Perhaps God was there all along, guiding hands to dig, hearts to endure, and a loyal dog to lead the way when sight failed. In our own lives, we may not face burning cabins or winter storms, but we all face moments when the world closes in, when truth feels fragile, and when the way forward is hidden. In those moments, remember this: God often prepares our refuge long before we know we'll need it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe in quiet miracles, in loyalty, and in second chances, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them most. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps through every storm and into the light beyond it.